The ideal ruler is a Muslim, an exemplary enemy, the hero of future chivalric novels, whom one can and should look up to. All this is the image of the famous Saladin. But an image created not in the East, but in the West. What is more in this image, the truth or PR? Why did everyone who stood in Saladin's way to power suddenly die? Why did he execute the philosopher of freethinkers and behead prisoners? How, perhaps, the most famous and most beautiful in its romantic naivety plot of the Crusade era. The noble friendship of two enemies, Saladin and Richard the Lionheart, began joint responsibility for mass murder. And finally, why the most terrible opponent of the Christian knights in the Holy Land eventually became almost a hero for Europeans. Hello everyone, I am Yeager Ziryanov, and you are on the Redroom channel, where we talk about the dead and the dead, about history. For almost 200 years, Europeans have made as many as 8 crusades, and this is the case when the first pancake was okay. But all the others came out lumpy. The first crusade was literally the only successful one of them. And the merit here is mainly luck. If the Crusaders had come to the Middle East a generation earlier, they would have faced a powerful Seljuk Empire, if a generation later. Then a powerful Zanjid state, and both of these meetings would most likely have ended badly. Naturally, Sofa conspiracy theorists have long since solved the whole secret. It's just that cunning, insidious and malicious Europeans ordered the murder of the Sultan in advance before the campaign. Of course, there is no confirmation of this. There are many other more convincing versions, but of course no one cares at all. Just forget it. In principle, I like this version too, quite action-packed. However, this is not a very significant myth. Much more often, one hears the story that, they say, the capture of Jerusalem by the Crusaders so powerfully rallied Muslims that in response, they immediately began to unite around the holy war with the Gentiles, a small jihad. In general, jihad is about spiritual struggle, killing atheists is a secondary matter here. In any case, although Jerusalem is the third city in Islam after the Media Mecca, as an economic, cultural and political center, it was much inferior to Baghdad, Cairo or Damascus, and Palestine itself was still the periphery of the Muslim world. Therefore, there was no immediate revenge after the capture of the city. For the first 50 years after that, the Europeans quietly created their crusader states in the region, while the Muslims continued to cut each other in the struggle for the remnants of the Seljuk Empire. And with many of them, the Franks, as they called all the Europeans there, traded, exchanged knowledge, smoked a hookah with a double apple on Saturdays, and that's all. Among the local rulers, there was one person who did not agree with this state of affairs, and another Zanji, who had been at war with other Muslims all his life. Apparently, at some point he got so tired of it that he decided to try a different way persuading people instead of killing them. He began to sell everyone the idea that the capture of Jerusalem half a century ago is a terrible insult, and a threat to the entire Islamic world. And in general, now he will show firm where an attack was being prepared on Baghdad. Theologians in the territories under his control began to drown for the holy war, while his other agitators explained to their neighbors that Zanji really did not even want all this power. Well, where would he go so much? Well, just who, if not him? Who, if not he, will defend the Muslim faith and expel the Franks from the sacred lands? However, few people bought it. Despite the fact that Zanji bore the title and Mat I, that is, the pillar of faith, he was, to put it mildly, poorly suited for this role, because this defender of Islam had been drinking heavily all his life, and was not too good for the role of the leader of jihad. By the way, he died because of drunkenness. One slave stabbed him in fright after another alcoholic party. I'm going to post more about this whole story about his relationship with slaves and alcohol in the cart after the release of this video. So subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. Nevertheless, Zanj won Odessa from the Crusaders, won almost the entire series, and generally got respect from others. At least because with the fall of Odessa, a period begins when Muslims in the East began to attack, not defend. In any case, it was this interesting man, Zanji, who at one time saved one of the generals of the Caliph of Baghdad. Zanji had a greater with him, and this commander eventually switched to his side and dragged his whole family with him. And it was at this court, at the court of Zanji, at the army of Zanji, and in this family, that our hero of today was born, whose name was Yusuf, and who will go down in history as Salakeddin or Saladin. His relatives participated in many battles of Zanji, while the future Saladin was doing quite unusual things. The son of the commandant of the fortress, a noble warrior, according to biographers, was engaged not in fencing, management or strategy, but in studying the Quran, rhetoric, and poetry, allegedly devoting 30 years of his 50 years to this cause in order to suddenly become a great commander, leading thousands of victorious armies. Apparently, the lack of interest in military affairs is still some kind of idealization of our hero's early years. But he was really interested in philosophy and theology with ferocious seriousness. At the end of his life, for example, he executed a philosopher simply for having developed the concept of combining Islam with the pre-Islamic philosophical tradition. In general, the already decentralized Islam was then experiencing a powerful split. In addition to Sunnis and Shiites, by the way, if you still don't know what the difference is between them, then watch our separate video. There were hundreds of other small sects of directions, and suddenly Saladin was the first ruler in the region who really cared about them. He had a vision, he adhered to it, and spent dozens of hours in theological debates. It seems that he took his overlord, Zanji, too seriously at one time, for whom faith was the main political tool. This was due to Saladin's deep family religiosity, and our hero grew up to be a real paladin of the Muslim faith. Excuse the pun. In any case, Muslim biographers draw him as such, and in the absence of anything else on the topic of his youth, we have to accept this point of view. The fall of Odessa excited everyone in Europe, and an army was assembled under the leadership of the kings of France and Germany to return the city. But upon arrival in Palestine, it became clear that Odessa was far away, it had recently been robbed, and there was no loot there. In short, everything was somehow lazy. Let's hit Damascus together. Local crusaders tried to explain to their colleagues that Damascus is their main ally in the region and in general. It is a complete wrecking, but they did not listen to them. The short siege ended in defeat and flight, but it gave us a legend. They say, then Saladin had a romance in Damascus with whom? And with the Queen of France Eleanor of Aquitaine, about whom we once had an issue. Of course, this is complete nonsense, because, firstly, despite the fact that Yusuf's relatives really lived in Damascus, he most likely was not present there. And secondly, there is no documentary evidence of this story, and thirdly, the boy was 11 years old at that time. However, this may not be an argument. In the end, Anakin Skywalker was not prevented by similar circumstances. I don't remember how old he was in jokes, you can correct me in the comments, in fact. A more important consequence of the siege for the residents of Damascus was the disappointment in yesterday's allies. The city went over to the side of Nuruddin. Moreover, the army of Damascus was commanded by Saladin's dad, and Nuruddin's army was commanded by Saladin's uncle. And in general, they all agreed there quite easily. And suddenly, the Crusaders found themselves in a situation where almost the entire former Seljuk Empire, modern Syria and Iraq, was already against their little Palestine. Then both sides of the conflict turned their attention to Egypt, whose wealth and resources could turn the situation around. The Shiite Caliphate of the Fatimids, who ruled this land, was no cake for a long time. The caliphs on the first space replaced each other, going in turn to the next world, in a variety of ways. Things were no better in other circles of power. The last caliph was so young that two viziers appeared with him at once, one actual, and the other, as usual, freshly overthrown. The latter offered Nuruddin the help of conquering Egypt, and the former, a crusader. Let's call the pro-European one a navel, and the pro-Muslim one a magnifying glass. Because you will instantly forget their names in another case anyway. The war lasted 5 years firm 1163rd year. The Muslims sent Saladin and his uncle there 3 times. For the first time, they outstripped the Crusaders and overthrew the vizier, who is the navel. Then Pupa tried to arrange an uprising of local Shiites against the newcomers Sunnis, which ended in failure. Practically no one joined him, and the guard guarding the navel stupidly gave his head to the Muslim troops who entered the city. Instead of the navel, a magnifying glass was appointed vizier, imposing taxes on Egypt. The Europeans promised more libertarian living conditions, you know, with low taxes and all that, so Lupa also defected to their side. And Saladin and his uncle again had to go to Egypt and fight there for a long and tedious time. It was then that Saladin first proved himself not only as a philosopher and theologian, but also as an excellent commander. The Europeans were never able to storm Alexandria, which he defended. In the end, they just essentially bought the city for 50,000 gold. And this is a strange outcome for the war, but let's say. Remember I said about the European promises to reduce taxes. So, it all turned out to be a complete bullshit. They pumped resources from Egypt just like that, and in the end, They deserved, in general, absolutely fair universal hatred from the locals. So when Saladin and his uncle, and it all sounds like one big series of Rick and Morty, came to Egypt for the third time, the Crusaders were simply forced to retreat. The Vizier Lupa was found, and wanted to appoint a puppet, but over the past 5 years, a young caliph has grown up, who immediately ordered this very Lupa to cut off his head. Yes, he remained a formal caliph all this time, you understood everything correctly. Instead of Lup, Saladin's uncle was appointed vizier. And it seems like this is all such a happy ending, but it ended a little unexpectedly. Because my beloved uncle died after some 2 months, according to the official version, from something like a stroke. But actually there is a nuance, because this death was only the first of a series of similar deaths in Saladin's life. And by similar, I mean suspicious, sudden, and very profitable for Saladin himself, who, for example, in this case was appointed vizier instead of his uncle. There is no evidence that he killed his uncle himself, but, you know, these wonderful coincidences. The Egyptian caliph probably expected that it would be easier with Aladdin than with his uncle, but he found exactly the opposite situation. Our hero did not put him in anything at all, immediately taking power into his own hands, and appointing his numerous relatives to all the most important state posts. The caliph immediately began to plot, and soon his eunuchs tried to kill the new vizier. Saladin uncovered the plot, and cut off the heads of the conspirator. Then, the Sudanese guard rose up against him, 50,000 black soldiers of the Egyptian army, the most combat-ready part of it. A brutal war began with the burning of the capital's neighborhoods, the killing of captured rebels, and even the devastation of distant Sudan, where Saladin sent an army led by his brother. After the rebellion failed, the young caliph for some reason suddenly fell ill and died, and Saladin became the sultan. By the way, the change in the supreme title was due to the fact that Saladin, being a Kurd by origin in general, was a Sunni. And, accordingly, he had his own caliph, a Sunni, and was sitting in Baghdad. By the way, it was on his behalf, even if it was formally, that Saladin ruled. It must be said here that it was Saladin who began to revive the Sunni tradition in Egypt. It was from that time that Egypt became a predominantly Sunni state. Nur is one who actually counted on Egyptian resources, and somehow was not happy that his former subordinate suddenly became his equal in strength. Not to mention the fact that the title of Saladin Sultan is actually the senior title of Atabak, which was worn by Nuruddin. Their relationship immediately deteriorated, and Nuruddin kept calling on Saladin to fix them, you know, to drink tea. But for some reason he absolutely did not want to go. And Atabak did not want to fight with the new Sultan. He had already been at war with the Franks and some Muslims. So somehow it was out of place. This ambiguous situation lasted for several years, and then suddenly Nuruddin fell ill and died. Well, you know, as it usually happens with all sorts of people who are not very convenient for Mr. Saladin. Nuruddin left behind an 11-year-old heir, around whom those who wanted to be regent with him immediately began to accumulate. And the fastest one here was, of course, Saladin. He and the army went to Syria, where the cities one by one opened the gates in front of him. And the unfortunate boy fled from the city to a new city, apparently suspecting that Saladin's care would not have a very good effect on his children's health. As a result, the heir found refuge in the city of Aleppo, whose residents did not give him up to Saladin. Saladin surrounded the city, and there suddenly an attempt was made on him, but the famous assassins themselves said that this attempt frightened the great commander and the Sultan so much that he simply lifted the siege and left. In fact, it happened for a different reason, of course. Saladin did not like besieging cities very much. Firstly, I will tell you why, and secondly, the ruler of Mosul came out against him with a war. And it was necessary to deal with this more urgent task. Having dealt with the army of Mosul, Saladin concluded peace with Aleppo. And 6 years later, Nuruddin's heir suddenly fell ill and died. During this time, Saladin managed to extend his power over vast areas from Carthage to Baghdad, from Mecca to Mesopotamia. And after the death of the young man, Aleppo and Massa entered the empire of Saladin. Naturally, all this unification did not happen bloodlessly. Just to talk about all these endless sieges, wars and battles would be very boring, long and not interesting. The main thing to remember here is that Saladin, although remembered in history as the main enemy of the Crusaders, most of his life actually fought with his co-religionists. And what were the Crusaders doing at that time? Probably, they were preparing with all their might for the upcoming war with the United States of Muslims. Well, not really. The Crusaders were at this moment figuring out who was the most important of them. They also had trouble with the ruler. The throne of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was occupied by Baldwin IV, a boy with leprosy. Some of the noble crusaders immediately grappled with each other for the right to be, of course, yes, his regent. And the rest simply gave up on the royal power and did what they wanted. One of the brightest crusader scumbags was Renaud de Chatillon. He was a Frenchman, came to Palestine as part of the Second Crusade, and after its defeat, he remained here, and was remembered by everyone as the main limitless of the era. And although everything in these wars revolved around religion, René de Chatillon managed to prove himself as a surprisingly non-religious person. First, he captured the Latin Patriarch of Antioch, whom he tortured by extorting money from him. Then he was captured by Muslims and spent 15 years in it, and when he returned and regained a high status, he came up with a super project for himself to penetrate into Arabia, destroy the tomb of the cursed camel driver in Medina, as he called Muhammad, and level the holy Kaaba in Mecca. To do this, he dragged several disassembled ships from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, assembled them there, and set sail to the shores of Arabia. Of course, this plan did not end well. The Muslims caught up with them quite easily, defeated and captured them, although Renaud himself managed to escape. And the prisoners were taken to Mecca, where they were slaughtered along with the traditional sacrifice of sheep. In fact, from the point of view of Islam, it was probably not very good, because it was too much like human sacrifice, which the Prophet strictly forbade. But from an emotional point of view, everything was okay. Renaud's actions really drove everyone to white heat. Saladin took full advantage of such a gift. It became an excellent occasion for a decisive attack on the Kingdom of Jerusalem. In March 1187th year, the cry of jihad sounded, and from all the edges of the vast Muslim world, troops flowed to Saladin. In Jerusalem, too, a gathering of troops was announced, and a huge army was assembled. The Crusaders were smarter and more experienced, advised to keep the defense based on their numerous castles. Crusade wars were generally continuous sieges of fortresses. Opponents were quite rare in the open field. But then the Crusader ruler, apparently, turned his head the number of their troops. There were 1,200 secular knights in it, but there were also knights, monks, Templars and Hospitallers, militia, mercenaries, and, of course, the most important thing, these people had a great shrine, the true cross, on which Christ was crucified. Well, how can you lose here, but to whom is he? As it turned out, it was possible. The Crusader column stretched across the arid desert, was waylaid by the army of Saladin Uriga from the mud, eventually surrounded, cut off from water sources, and shot with bows, followed by finishing total and humiliating destruction. The king of Jerusalem, Gid Luzinian, was brought to the Sultan's tent together with Reneshidilun. The first one he treated with sherbet, as is known from sources, and the second one simply cut off his head, almost on the spot. And at the same time, about 200 Knights Templar and Hospitallers were beheaded, because they were offered to convert to Islam. But they, as decent Christians and knights, naturally refused, for which they paid. The fate of the true cross, captured by the Muslims, is quite interesting, because then the Christians tried for a very long time to buy it from Saladin, or exchange it for something, but Saladin stubbornly refused. Although it seems that from time to time he showed this true cross to some particularly important prisoner. Then this cross appeared in Damascus, then it was seen in Baghdad, then it surfaced in Constantinople. And Christian monks were confused in trying to keep track of the travels of this incredible artifact. Now, of course, well, it is generally clear to everyone that these were idol crosses, but of course all as one, of course, is true. The defeat at Khotin drained the Jerusalem kingdom of blood, and its fall became inevitable. Saladin's offensive in general resembled a triumphal procession, not a conquest. Castles and cities opened their gates to him. And here it is worth saying a few words about the famous nobility of Saladin. He always released the knights who surrendered to him, often even without ransom, only taking from them the words that they would no longer fight with him and would go home to Europe. Almost all the knights eventually deceived him, and simply moved from the surrendered castle to the non-surrendered one, strengthening the garrison there. Nevertheless, Saladin did not change his policy, and still released those who handed over the locks to him without a fight. Then numerous biographers will express their delight at such nobility for whole pages. Here they say, even though the enemies were pigs, but still the Sultan did not resemble them, and continued to treat Christians with amazing nobility. However, there was a very practical reason for this nobility. Saladin extremely disliked sieges, and it can be understood, because a siege is generally a very difficult occupation. In those days, the main people in the siege were the people who made the mines, while the rest of the army was generally languishing in idleness. And when soldiers are idle, they usually start singing, stealing something, raping someone, or, worst of all, running away from the army. And all this, of course, often happened at the same time. During the sieges of the besieging army, they often just melted, damn, like spring snow. Saladin simply could not afford such a number of long sieges, because then the conquest of the kingdom of Jerusalem would drag on for a damn eternity. So he showed his idiotically noble nobility by letting the besieged out of the castle, knowing that they would fight against him again. As it was, almost the entire kingdom soon came under his rule, with only 2 cities remaining for Christians, Tyre, Jerusalem. In a good way, it was necessary to take the first city first, an important port for European reinforcements. But it didn't work out on the spur of the moment to agree on the surrender. I'll tell you more about it in the telegram. So Saladin spat and went to Jerusalem. It's all going to come back to him, of course. Regarding the capture of Jerusalem, everyone likes to remember that the Muslims did not arrange a massacre there. They say that when the Crusaders took the city, they walked there so that according to the descriptions of eyewitnesses, it was impossible to walk along the unpaved streets. So much blood was spilled that my feet were stuck in the mud, and a lot of pieces of human bodies were lying around. But perhaps the point here is not that the Crusaders are bad, but the Saracens are good. The Crusaders stormed Jerusalem, and it surrendered as a Saracen. According to medieval concepts, a massacre in a surrendered city was considered lawless, and if the city did not surrender, then the stormers had the right to do whatever they wanted with its inhabitants. Well, like they were offered in a good way, right? And, by the way, Saladin was just in the mood to have a little talk in Jerusalem. He wanted to take the city by storm and take his soul there. He knew that Jerusalem was defended by only 3 knights and a handful of citizens, not a garrison for one laugh. However, the defenders explained to him that when the Muslims broke through the walls, the Christians would first kill 5,000 Muslim prisoners, then destroy and desecrate all the mosques, and then accept death in battle, as befits knights. Saladin did not like this prospect somehow, and had to negotiate the surrender. This story also added to his popularity, because he did not destroy the main Christian shrines, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Hospital of the Order of Hospitallers. While at one time the Crusaders, who entered Jerusalem, arranged stables in the 3rd most important mosque of Islam for a second. However, medieval nobility should not be overestimated. If the city surrendered, and its inhabitants were spared, and the massacre did not begin there, this does not mean at all that everything was fine with the residents in the end. Saladin appointed a relatively small amount, 10 gold pieces for an adult man, and some nuances there about a woman and children. Nevertheless, many poor people did not have such money, so suddenly a fair of nobility began. Various noble knights began to redeem the common people, and even Saladin himself and his brother gave out 1,000 gold pieces for the ransom of prisoners. It was possible to redeem the rest with the money of the church, since the Patriarch of Jerusalem had a lot of gold. But he took out tons of gold and silver products from the churches, paying the same ransom of 10 gold pieces for himself, and not giving a single coin to ransom the poor. When Saladin was informed about this old fraudster, he replied that there was nothing to be done, since he was such an unscrupulous person. He released the Patriarch, sold 15,000 poor people who could not redeem themselves into slavery. Europe was shocked by the fall of Jerusalem, since Saladin's had not yet had time to heroize his opponents. Letters with terrible stories began to be sent to the editorial office of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, as Saladin, they say, tried to burn the Holy Cross in Jerusalem. It didn't work out because he was very holy. In England and France, the Saladin tax was introduced, one of the first recorded income taxes. Everyone paid 10% of their income and the value of movable property. As they say, just give the state a reason to conduct a new tax. By the way, beer was considered such movable property. No, just imagine how the British hated Saladin after the introduction of the beer tax. It is generally known that in England, £70,000 sterling were collected from Christians and 12,000 from Jews. According to current money, this is about £150 million sterling. Only participants of the new crusade were exempt from payment, so people were additionally motivated to enroll in it. By the way, a lot of people were recorded. The whole flower of European chivalry went to reconquer the holy city from the Muslims. The campaign was led by three major European kings, the French Philip Augustus, the English Richard the Lionheart, and the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. It was a medieval dream team, practically a supergroup. But you know, most of the projects of supergroups in the world of music are not that successful and, in general, this campaign began with the fact that Emperor Frederick fell off his horse and drowned in a knee-deep river. As they say, be careful with swimming in heavy armor. The remaining two kings arrived in Palestine when there had long been a heavy Christian siege of the city of Acre. The defenders of Tyre, who were not finished by Saladin, besieged this important port fortress, and they themselves, in turn, were besieged by Saladin. The military operations lasted for 3 years, cost both sides huge sacrifices, and were conducted in very difficult conditions. Similar to the front of the First World War. Trenches, rats, mud, dysentery, endless skirmishes, a lot of victims, and very little use. When Philip and Richard found themselves under the Acre, the first thing they did was get sick and almost died. But then they took revenge, showing the locals all sorts of wonders of military engineering, and it was distributed. On the terms that 200,000 gold dinars were paid to the Crusaders. 1,600 prisoners were released by the Muslims, and the true cross was returned. Moreover, no one agreed on these conditions with the Sultan. Saladin was simply confronted with the fact. He did not want to give up the cross at all, and he was ready to give up prisoners and gold, only in exchange for the release of all the inhabitants of Acre. A dispute began, the young King Richard disagreed, and in the end, he freaked out, and ordered the execution and beheading of all prisoners. 3,000 people. By the way, I don't think anyone was happy about it at all, including the executioners, because according to various sources, this whole execution lasted from 1 day to 3 days. And it was also clearly not happy about completely random Christians who caught Saladin's eye in the coming days. You know, all sorts of translators, messengers, I don't know, random deliverers from Amazon. Because Saladin sent them all to the next world. Irritation is such a thing. The French King Philip, whose relationship with Richard can best be described by the phrase mutual total hatred, sailed back to Europe. And Richard went on a grueling hike along the coast to Jerusalem. Under constant shelling by Muslim archers, the Crusaders marched more than 100 kilometers, and even defeated the enemy. In the Battle of Arsuf. It was already deep autumn, and Saladin dismissed most of the troops to their homes. There was feudalism, and the warriors served their overlord only at certain times of the year. Richard was delighted that this was his chance to take the holy city, and immediately set off on a campaign from the coast deep into Palestine. But it quickly became clear why the locals do not fight in winter. In December, it rained and rained like a bucket for many days. The dry Palestinian land has turned into a swamp, named after Hideaki Miyazaki. During the offensive of the Christ-bearers, they got stuck in this mud, and they simply could not physically reach Jerusalem. They even saw this city in the distance, but it was impossible to get to it. A year later, Richard made another attempt, but was forced to turn back when the city was only 12 miles away. In desperation, Richard offered Saladin some completely insane projects, like that his sister would marry Saladin. And the city would become Christian and be governed by Christians, but at the same time, it would be under the control of the Sultan. Until the Jura. In general, any such schizophrenia, which Saladin politely refused. So Richard sailed away from Palestine with nothing. And Saladin returned to Damascus, where a year later, on the 4th of March, 1193, he died. His biographer Bahauddin writes with delight that Saladin left behind only 47 nari dirhams and a single Turek gold bar. He distributed all his wealth to the needy, as befits a righteous Muslim. This is a little reminiscent of the delight of some of our compatriots, who recall that Comrade Stalin left 3 rubles and a shabby overcoat. But in fact, of course, one should not be surprised at such asceticism, because Saladin had huge personal funds for a fig. If he always had access to the treasury of his huge state. He was buried without pomp, in a modest wooden sarcophagus, as he had bequeathed. But in many ways, his story did not end at that moment, but only began. The participants of the Third Crusade returned to Europe with defeat and faced the need to somehow explain this defeat. And the genius of the enemy suddenly became an excellent explanation. The chroniclers of the Third Campaign began to portray Saladin as a noble opponent, a humane ruler, and a wise man. His relationship with Richard is quite specific actually. Richard was more friends with Saladin's brother, and he had never even met the Sultan himself. They communicated by correspondence. However, he was really very kind. In general, their relationship, one way or another, became an image of a chivalrous attitude towards the enemy. Moreover, the later the essay is written, the more this topic develops there. In the works of the 13th century, Saladin appears to the rulers, although unbaptized, but possessing all the Christian virtues. Well, it was necessary to explain somehow why a Muslim won the Christian war. You see, actually, because he was more of a Christian than they were. In the 14th century, this story is brought to logical perfection. There are plots in which Saladin accepts Christianity and a knightly vow, and thus becomes a crusader. Sort of. As a result, in the Divine Comedy, Saladin sits in the first circle of hell with virtuous pagans like Plato. And in Walter Scott, he heals Richard the Lionheart altogether. But in the Muslim world, the memory of him was formed in a different way. The Ubaid dynasty created by him quickly became mired in internecine strife, and, in general, disappeared after about half a century. There was no one to glorify and praise the deceased sultan. However, Muslims quickly forgot the entire era of the Crusades. The first book about the Wars of the Cross in Arabic was published only in the second half of the 19th century. And it was not an independent work of a Muslim author, but a translation of a French work. The main event of medieval history for Muslim historians for a long time remained far from the Crusades, but the Mongol invasion, which shocked the Middle East to a much greater extent. However, by the 20th century, Muslim rulers finally realized the full propaganda power, the full propaganda potential of this topic. There is the unification of all Muslims, and an ideal ruler who rules with an iron hand, and protection of Christians from Europeans, and religious fundamentalism and orthodox Sunnism. In general, a complete set. Books began to come out one after another. The image of Saladin as an ideal ruler who united all possible Muslims, regardless of their language and place of residence, against the damned Christian Europeans has become very, very convenient for many Muslim rulers. And, of course, this topic became especially acute after the Second World War, especially all this became relevant after the birth of the State of Israel. As a great role model in the fight against Western imperialists and in the return of the Holy Land, Saladin was revered by Gamal Abdel Nasser, Osama bin Laden, and Saddam Hussein. The latter actually created a whole cult of Saladin. Fortunately, they were born in the same city, Tikrit. And the parallels were clear here. However, this did not prevent Saddam from organizing a genocide of the Kurds, to whom the famous Sultan also belonged by origin. And what could be a more colorful illustration of how historical propaganda works? Write what you think about Saladin in the comments, which image is closer to you, what you think is plausible, what you think is embellishment. It will be interesting to read, because the figure is mythologized no less than some Rommel, for example. In any case, if you like this video, please like it. Do not forget to share this video, and subscribe to the channel, if you still have not done so. And if you want to support us, then you can do it with a foreign card on Patreon, or with a Russian card on Boost. It will be very cool, we will be very grateful to you for it. Thanks to those who already support us there. Thanks to everyone else who watches these videos. I hope you were interested. Well, we will see you again very soon.